This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our spring 2025 season concluded on June 11th with a talk by Dr. Arthur Gullachsen of Royal Military College, whose topic was the SS in Normandy. Over to you, James and Arthur.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. So nice to see another great turnout, and I know it's going to be another fantastic presentation. Tonight's speaker is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a Professor in the History Department at the Royal Military College of Canada, and the author of 4 books. A Second World War specialist, his areas of expertise include the study of the replacement of equipment and personnel losses, as well as German armoured forces during the late war period. He is also interested in 20th century air power and sea power. He recently published Bloody Verrières, volumes 1 and 2, which will be the subject of the presentation this evening. And his newest book is The Defeat and Attrition of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, volume 1. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Arthur Gullachsen.
Well, very nice to see you all here. I would like to thank the RCMI, James Ellis, and my PhD student, Simon Waring, and also from New York State, my former PhD student, Pete Owen, who's arrived here with his wife, and everyone here at the RCMI for arranging this night and having me drop by. All right, today's talk. Today I'd like to summarize the main ideas presented in the 2 volumes of my book series, Bloody Verrières, and present my interpretation of the period studied during the Normandy campaign from 18th July to 5th of August 1944. My main points today. First, I'll talk a little bit about the subject matter, my motivation to conduct this research, historical questions that I addressed in the course of these 2 volumes, my research methods, how I went about it, and the thesis statement, my big idea that I present in these 2 books. And then, of course, I'll do a summary of the battles, 18th of July to 5th of August 1944. And then I'll provide some conclusions. So, these 2 ridges, the Verrières and Bourguebus ridges, they are the main characters in these books. They're present in every chapter, every battle. These high features south of the city of Caen are very important militarily due to the ability of an observer to see the enemy at great distance, to use indirect and direct fire on them, and also destroy the enemy from a reverse slope position, firing at them as they come over the crest of the hill. And you see Bourguebus Ridge there, very good, of course, tank country, has a tank commander. It's just perfect. And then the more well-known for Canadian military historians, the Verrières Ridge. And you see the village of Mace-Rouen. It's not a village anymore, now it's a town, but you see the high feature there. And if you look to the map in green on the right, you see the point 67, which is the high point where they have a memorial today to the Normandy campaign and the fighting around Saint-André and Mace-Rouen and Verrières Ridge. As well as you look down and you see the dark green area, that's the Verrières Ridge, the kidney-shaped high ground, which is, of course, is very, very tactically important and seen as vital by the Germans, vital to their defense. So, why did I write these books? Why did the subject matter interest me? I became fascinated with the amount of resources and effort the Germans put into defending a series of geographical points, hills and ridges, south and west of the Orne River, and the Bourguebus and Verrières ridges east of the Orne, south of Caen. The latter set of ridges is the area that is the scene for the 2 books. I wanted to gain a better understanding of why Anglo-Canadian forces in late July and early August had such a difficult time attacking the ridges to the east. This is the Verrières and Bourguebus ridges. Using massive resources in the way of armored units, infantry, artillery, and heavy bombers, Major Allied operations such as Goodwood, Atlantic, Spring, and other smaller attacks in the period 18th of July to the 5th of August all failed to break out or only partially successful in achieving their goals. Part of these operations, I'm sad to say, were outright disasters and tactical defeats for the Allies. So, what does this beautiful tank country mean? Why is it so important to the Germans? This was perfect tank country for a tank commander. To the Germans, this was almost a second Battle of El Alamein, the decisive battle in North Africa. And it was one that now they had the resources to win this decisive defensive battle. And they were determined to win it. This is where they figured the deciding event would occur, they felt. Everything else along the front was to a certain degree largely neglected. And despite every factor in Normandy working against them, the Germans, they become fixated. So, historians such as the late Michael Reynolds, the famous British general turned military historian, did work on the Germans in this period, but there was still a hole in the Normandy historiography. No ultra-detailed account of Goodwood, Atlantic, and Spring existed from the German perspective. The approaches of French military historians are unique. They cover both sides, and I feel some of the best books written today on Normandy are, of course, by the French. It is their military history, and they very much see it as such. I thought also the impact of Operation Goodwood on the German military was misunderstood and much more important. I also wanted to re-examine the role of the British and Canadian armies during this period. So, historical questions that I addressed. Who were these Germans fighting the Canadians and the British? How are they organized and led? How did they conduct their defense? How did they fight? What was contact with the British and Canadian armies to be on the receiving end of it? What was it actually like? Insights into these questions was largely a blank slate. And accounts by Michael Reynolds, the retired British general, you see him there. He ties his tie much better than I tie mine, but his accounts somewhat lack detail and analysis. And then there was this, the myth of Operation Goodwood. It is a battle that was analyzed on British Army staff tours that would draw parallels to a future war in West Germany against the Red Army with their tank hordes. How would the NATO British forces seek to resist this huge attack? And Operation Goodwood, with the British attacking with 3 armored divisions, supposedly outmatching the Germans in every way possible, shape, and form, this was supposedly a perfect case study showing how an inferior force held off the powerful British Second Army. And how could we possibly, as these British tour guides for these staff officer rides, how could we incorporate our new Bundeswehr allies and their veterans to provide the German perspective? But there was a certain group who was the main enemy of the British and Canadian armies south of Caen, and for reasons of political necessity and their identity, could not be part of this narrative. So, the battle on the German side became about a series of bit players of the German Das Heer, the regular army. Like Major Hans von Luck, you see him there as a TV talking head, and his fellow officers of the 21st Panzer Division, and others like Lieutenant Richard Freiherr von Rosen of Sphere Panzer Abteilung 503, the Tiger tank commander, some of them embracing media status to tell their stories that become embellished over the years. But of course, this is almost a one-sided narrative. And then there's these ones that were never on the battlefield tours, but they were actually doing the fighting of the British Second Army. The major forces that fought the British Second Army south of Caen were all Waffen-SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party. Were they war criminals? Yes. Nearly all high-ranking officers that survived in my series of books were prosecuted for war crimes post-war. They were the military elite of the Third Reich. You see him on the top right there, Sturmbannführer Herbert Kuhlmann. He's the commander of the Panther Tank Battalion, the Panther Abteilung. He went on to a successful business career in Argentina and helped one Joseph Mengele escape into the jungles of South America. And others, such as Joachim Peiper, you see him to Kuhlmann's left, commander of SS Panzer Regiment 1, conducted all the armored operations south of Caen and was very, very influential. But Canadians studying military history today in Canada, we know about Kurt Meyer, but no one knows about Joachim Peiper and his operations, which are arguably much more influential. And then there's others, such as Joseph Diefenthal, also prosecuted with Peiper post-war for the Malmedy war crimes massacre during the Ardennes offensive and the execution of US troops. He was responsible for inflicting a huge number of casualties on Canadian forces during the battles of Tilly-la-Campagne as commander of the 3rd Battalion of SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment 2. So they're not part of the historical narrative post-war, and their role became largely unknown to the British and Canadian public and was omitted from the discussion of Goodwood and the mediaization of Goodwood and its study by the British Army. And also there was this. What exactly, in my mind, I was very interested in what was a Panzer Corps or Armored Corps Hauptquartier, or their headquarters. What was the formation the British and Canadians were fighting against? How did this headquarters work? How did it control its divisions? What were its components? Its key officers. Was its commander? You see him there walking with Erwin Rommel. Josef Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, Liebstandarte. Was he the buffoon that he was made out to be, the Nazi toady who's promoted past his capabilities simply because of his loyalty to Adolf Hitler? And was the man behind the scenes, Brigadenführer Fritz Kramer, was he actually running the show? Was he the brains behind the operation? And this is a huge hole in the historiography of military history today. Do we ever study a corps headquarters? Has anyone ever written a book about the 2nd Canadian Corps, or the British 8th Corps? Despite, unit histories post-war, these books don't exist. They have yet to be written. So my approach, I go into ultra detail, each chapter in both books being a day. I translated a lot of French authors, as well as primary sources, and materials, reproductions bought from the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, their military archive, and I focus on the event and put a huge amount of detail into both sets of armies. But I look at things from the German perspective. So, this brings us to the big finish here. Not the big finish, but the thesis statement, my main idea. South of the Norman city of Caen, the twin features of Verrières and Bourguebus ridges were key stepping stones for the British Second Army in late July 1944. Taking them was crucial if it was to be successful in its attempt to break out of the Normandy bridgehead. To capture this vital ground, the Allied forces would have to defeat arguably the strongest German armored formation in Normandy, the 1st SS Panzer Corps Liebstandarte. The resulting battles in late July and early August 1944 saw powerful German defensive counterattacks south of Caen inflict tremendous casualties, at times even regaining lost ground and defeating Anglo-Canadian operations in detail. Viewed by the German military leadership as critical, the majority of their armored assets were deployed to dominate this excellent tank country east of the Orne River. These defeats and the experience of meeting an enemy with near equal resources exposed at times a flawed Anglo-Canadian offensive tactical doctrine that was overly dependent on the supremacy of its artillery forces, thus being the Royal Artillery and Royal Canadian Artillery. Furthermore, weaknesses in Allied tank technology inhibited their armored forces from fighting a decisive armored battle, forcing Anglo-Canadian infantry and artillery forces later to rely on First World War infantry bite-and-hold tactics, massively supported by artillery and airstrikes. So, what were these challenges that were affecting the Germans and giving them such a terrible time in Normandy? Every time they lost a tank, there would be no replacement tank. Every time they lost a truck, the same deal. The railroad system is largely unusable in northwestern France. There's no new infantry replacements for those killed, wounded, or captured. No ammunition in huge piles and stockpiles, no constant air superiority or constant lift-off of ground attack missions, and there's no ability of the Germans to conduct mobile warfare, as the panzer divisions were designed to carry out. Hitler, of course, dictated no steps back, no step back. You will hold your positions where they are, and you will die in your trenches if need be. And there's no regular supply of fuel or ammunition. And this was very important because Normandy was very much an artillery war. So we see here the collisions of doctrine. For the Anglo-Canadians, everything is very much artillery-centered operations versus the Germans with Panzer Group-based operations. The Anglo-Canadians are dominant artillery and have air superiority, but they're weaker in armored operations. The Germans have dominance in armored operations, but are very weak in logistics, artillery, infantry, and air superiority matters. So this brings us to the 18th of July, or the 17th of July, the day before Goodwood, which is now known as the largest tank battle to be fought in the history of the British Army. As we can see there in those sort of dark squares, those are the areas to be bombed. And there's a huge aerial bombardment using 4-engine bombers that were bombing Germany at this time. And the United States Army Air Force and the RAF Bomber Command targeted these squares. And using aerial bombardment literally blasted the German formations from the face of the earth, turning giant Tiger tanks over and completely destroying the German communication network. 3 British armored divisions are ready to attack, but there's a terrible problem. There's not enough room for them. And so they're lined up nose to tail, just like 3 people entering the Hudson's Bay department store through a revolving door. Not all 3 of these people can enter the Hudson's Bay department store at once, but they have to wait for the revolving door to spin them around. And that's the way for the armored corps, the armored brigades. But there's a huge amount of resources. And even though the British will say later, after the Second World War, this was a holding attack or designed to draw away the German armor. This was very much a decisive attack to break out, to actually end the Normandy campaign and escape, not escape, but break out into metropolitan France. And, of course, the Canadians and the British First Corps on either side, so the attacking British 8th Corps with its 3 armored divisions have a role to play. If you look on the far right of the map, the British First Corps will attack out of the British airborne bridgehead on the Orne to attack into the forest there to protect the flank of the 8th Corps. The Canadians, the 2nd Corps, the newly activated 2nd Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, will clear the southern suburbs of Caen and also cross the Orne River with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, as you see there on the center of the left-hand side of the map. And it's a very, very ambitious plan. Once these 3 armored divisions have been cut loose and can shake loose in this perfect tank country south of Caen, one is to head to the east and 2 are to head immediately south, along 1 on each side of the Route Nationale 158 to Falaise, to break out. And so battle comes, and the Canadians and the British push forward after this huge aerial bombardment, which is absolutely devastating for the Germans. Initially, it's a huge success. The 16th Luftwaffe Feld Division, a ground infantry division of the German Air Force, which has been pressed into service, is completely overwhelmed. And the British tanks run right over it. And then the British, they're not happy with that. They defeat in detail any elements of the 21st Panzer Division they encounter, and 1 heavy Tiger tank battalion that is ready to counterattack. It's hit by the bombers, and the tanks are literally, these huge behemoths are literally turned over on their tails. So yes, it's all going wonderfully well. And the Canadians are advancing along the southern suburbs of Caen, and they do a successful crossing of the Orne, and they defeat what elements of the 272nd Infantry Division they encounter, and thus the British are moving very, very aggressively with which is arguably with the best British armored division in the British Army, the 11th Armored Division, and following hot on their heels are the 11th and Guards Armored Divisions. And then we see a certain division make its appearance on the top of Borgebus Ridge. And the event of this division completely throws the plan of Goodwood. It completely stops it, it halts it, it completely upends it, and it destroys the schedule of the British. This is the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, and it puts in not one, but 2 massive attacks on the leading regiments of the British 29th Armored Brigade. And we see on the left, as the British are approaching Verrières or Borgebus Ridge, and as in a period of 10 minutes, a huge amount of British tanks are knocked out by anti-tank gunfire, Tiger tank fire, as well as the last dregs of the 21st Panzer Division, which in a desperate defense to stop the British seizing Borgebus Ridge, attack with everything they had. And as the British are reeling from this fusillade of armored piercing shells, the Panther Abteilung of the 1st SS Panzer Division drives down the ridge, and it takes the villages of Solières, it takes the village of Fours. It also moves into Braz as well, and the British are literally shot out of these villages. And they go too far, and some Panthers are knocked out as the British pull back a bit and continue to fight, but it's a very, very desperate battle. And so, needing to refuel and rearm, the tanks from each side pull back a bit. And in the evening, as the British tanks are refueling and rearming, just beside the railroad line you see there that runs from Caen to the city or town of Cagny, you see it in the top right, the commander of the Leibstandarte sees the British tanks refueling and rearming, and he orders another attack, this time with the assault gun battalion of the Leibstandarte, as well as the Panthers again, and they go at them again, and they inflict such damage, the British retreat over the raised railway line where they can get some kind of shelter from the armored piercing shells. And so, with these 2 attacks, the Leibstandarte has bought time for the infantry component of this division to move forward, and it seizes and defends all the villages that the battle took place, almost exclusively tank versus tank. And at the end of the day, the British 29th Armored Brigade is largely destroyed. The Germans have possession of the Borgebus Ridge, and one of the greatest tactical defeats ever inflicted on the British Army has taken place. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions and their armored brigades, the Guards Armored and the 7th Armored Division, do not attack, but completely regroup and make a plan for the next day, in which they use infantry and the infantry first tactics to support tiny attacks that seizes all the villages south or north of Borgebus Ridge, and the Germans retreat onto Borgebus Ridge. And then at this specific time, the weather intervenes. It begins to rain, and it rains a huge amount. And the British make the decision, right or wrong, to stop Goodwood. It hasn't, played out the way they wanted it to. And while they've seized these villages on the northern slope of Borgebus Ridge, that is as far as they will go. But there's a second part of Goodwood, Atlantic, which is the Canadian component, which is going great guns and having great success to the north as this huge tank battle is taking place. And thus, with the British shutting down their offensive, the Germans have the opportunity to shift their armored units onto the Canadians. Now, Lieutenant General Simmons, he sees Verrières Ridge and has it in his sights. And he has decided he is going to seize it. But General Simmons is a veteran of the Italian campaign, and he is fighting as if he is still in Italy, very much against a withdrawing German enemy, a German enemy not exactly fighting as hard as they're fighting here in Normandy, and one that is not the Waffen SS. And he seeks to set out with the elements of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division to seize Verrières Ridge and consolidate on it, and thus he will succeed where Richard O'Connor, the 8th Corps commander, had failed. But in the pouring rain, the Germans set upon the Canadian infantry battalions, destroying the Fusilier Montreal, destroying the South Saskatchewan Regiment, destroying parts of the Essex Scottish, and the South Sherbrooke Fusiliers and Camerons of Canada from Winnipeg managed to barely hold on in St. Andre-sur-Orne against determined attacks from another Panzer Division who's been brought in as a battle group. This is the 2nd Panzer Division. And of course, this is another Panzer Division that we don't hear much about when we're learning about Canadian military history, even though these huge battles take place. So the 2nd Panzer Division forces from the west and the 1st SS Panzer Division move in and attack. And they solidify their control on Verrières Ridge, which they see as militarily vital. And so this fighting goes on the 20th and 21st of July and causes a huge amount of casualties to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, thus causing the infantry reinforcement crisis which occurs in August. Due to the fact that this is an all-volunteer Canadian Army and these casualties that are inflicted are completely off the charts. And this brings us to the 2nd book in the series, which covers the events 23rd July to the 5th of August. So now, with the Germans, solidifying their control over these 2 sets of ridges, it is the Canadians' turn with this brand new Canadian Corps. And of course, we see Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, more British than British, speaks with a British accent. And of course, he's indicating to Miles Dempsey, the commander of the British Second Army, to Monty, the commander of the 21st Army Group, and the visiting Prime Minister with the cigar in his mouth, Winston Churchill. He is motioning towards Verrières Ridge in this photo. He was saying that my attack will be different. I've seen the British fail. I've seen these fields of burning British tanks, and I will succeed where they have failed because I will make my attack at night. And he makes his plan that he will conduct the break-in battle with his Canadian infantry battalions of what's left of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and attack and break in and defeat the Germans at night. And thus, 2 British armored divisions that are waiting, the Guards Armored and the 7th Armored Division, will charge forward. And there he is. Of course, you see him on the top right, more British than British, born in Britain, Guy Simonds, and Brigadier Young, the commander, RMC graduate, commander of the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which sees terrible losses inflicted upon it during this operation, which is named Spring. And the plans are for several Canadian infantry battalions to attack, gain the top of Verrières Ridge, and allowing the British armored divisions to charge forward, again, right down the Route Nationale 158 to Falaise, breaking out of the Normandy gridlock of the bridgehead, and thus delivering victory in the Normandy campaign. And for those, of course, post-war who spin this as just another holding attack, it was nothing of the kind. This was a breakout operation, intended to break out with 2 British armored divisions who had charged very much in a cavalry-type charge right to Falaise. And there's also something about this for the German defenses. I was fascinated about this. There's 2 huge mine shafts that go off from the Orne River and penetrate, right, one along the slope of Verrières Ridge, another right through its summit, and move forward. And the Germans use these for to move reinforcements, to evacuate casualties, to put caches of ammunition and mortar rounds, to make command posts, but they could literally pop up in different locations of the battlefield. And the Canadians knew nothing about these mine shafts. And so I included this map made by Mike Bechtold in the new book, or in the Bloody Verrières Volume 2, that shows the extent of the German defensive infrastructure and how they could use these. And of course, we have the terrible tragedy of the forces from the 2nd Panzer Division destroying the Black Watch using anti-aircraft searchlights during the night. The Canadian infantry battalions had gone forward to attack in the darkness. The light from the anti-aircraft searchlights, called Monty's moonlight, was intended to give the infantry a little bit of light so they could see what they're doing and to navigate and attack their proper locations. The Germans, however, quickly discovered that the Canadian infantrymen were silhouetted by this. They were quickly machine gunned. And these first infantry battalions failed to meet their objectives, but the Black Watch of Montreal attacked regardless. Phil Griffin, of course, Major Phil Griffin, acting commanding officer, CO of the Black Watch, attacks directly over Verrières Ridge, of course, into the MG-42 machine guns and Panzer IV tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Regiment 3, which annihilates all 4 companies, and then a huge counterattack roars right over the top of Verrières Ridge. This is executed by him, of course, another person unknown in Canadian military history, Werner Sturz, Major Sturz of Kampfgruppe Sturz, the commander of Panzerjäger Abteilung 38 of the 2nd Panzer Division, who takes the remaining Black Watch survivors prisoner. And this event is somewhat burned into the Canadian historiography. It's a seminal event that speaks to the sacrifice of the all-volunteer Canadian Army that is taking these huge infantry casualties that it cannot afford to take without conscription, leading later to the very much the resignation of the Minister of National Defense, Ralston, and the execution of conscription in Canada in 1945 and late 1944. The one high point or victory of Operation Spring is Verrières Village. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry attacks in a very, very determined manner and takes the village and drives the Waffen-SS out. Now they, of course, retreat just south of the village into the dead ground beside it, and a huge number of armored assets are brought in to retake the village. Of course, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry conducts a brilliant defense, defeating the Germans, but there's also something that is also swept under the rug somewhat in this account of this battle. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry is saved by the 1st Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, 1 RTR, which charges in and fights off the German Panzer IV and Panther tanks that are getting ready to attack it. And at a critical moment, as the Panther tanks are leaning into a second assault, a flight or a squadron of RAF Hawker Typhoons comes in and strafes them from behind, thus allowing the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry to survive. But this battalion and its victory is in sharp contrast to the remaining battalions in this very much this dark chapter of Canadian military history as we struggle on Verrières Ridge. And the worst of it is here. You see this village here, this is Tilly-la-Campagne. It was wiped off the face of the earth by August 1944, and it was never rebuilt for the French. I guess there is the danger that it potentially could become sort of some kind of Waffen-SS pilgrimage or something like that by far-right elements in Germany today. But the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade has its part in Spring from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and attacks it with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and supported by the Fort Garry Horse Tanks, a regiment I was a member of when I came out of high school. There's very fierce German resistance, very strong German forces are present, and this battle goes on all day long. There's several attacks with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, and at a critical moment, Major General Keller, the commander of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, arrives at the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade headquarters, and he demands that more forces be committed. And the commander of the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders and the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade commander, Brigadier Cunningham, resist this very vociferously. They say, no, we will not throw good money after bad and contribute to higher losses. Other people interpret this refusal in different ways. I won't, try not to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but it is a very, very brutal battle. And you see by the photograph there at the end of August, the village is literally wiped off the face of the earth. But the Germans see it as tactically important, and so they throw more and more forces into it, eventually hiding in cellars and having tanks in burned out buildings. Their defenses are very strong. And then the Germans, of course, at this time, they see this as another Goodwood. They see this as another big attack. And once they get their resources and their reinforcements going, once they set them loose, they can't really stop them. So we have yet another Panzer Division that appears on the scene. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, led by Brigadenführer Sylvester Stadler. You see him there on the Eastern Front. And after the battles you see on that map there that have actually eventually, or very much, destroyed or defeated Spring, he goes in with his forces to solidify the control of Verrières Ridge. And so these are almost two forgotten counterattacks as the Germans storm up Verrières Ridge, and they fight this all-day tank battle with the British 22nd Armored Brigade and its regiments, and eventually, slowly but surely, they push the British off Verrières Ridge. And you see the British 7th Armored Division very much pushing forward there in these maps. That is because the British High Command and the command of the 2nd Canadian Corps were very much worried, almost some would say terrified, that the Canadian front line would cave in at this point. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had taken such tremendous losses, and with the advent of this new Panzer Division, one of which we never really learn about in Canadian military history classes, or these attacks, they were very much afraid of the consequences of its presence. However, despite losing Macerorn and Verrières Ridge, we hold on to St. Andre and Point 67, and these battles that go on all day long on the 26th and 27th of July are very, very fierce, very, very intense as far as tank battles of the Canadian Army. And of course, with all these good Panzer divisions, all these resources here on Verrières Ridge, on Borgebus Ridge, could they be at two places at once? Absolutely not. And thus, it happens. Operation Cobra is unleashed. The United States Army Air Force, as you've seen in this current TV show, The Masters of the Air, it appears with all its B-17 bombers, and it carpet bombs the Germans. And the Germans, because they placed all their very good Panzer divisions opposing the 2nd Canadian Corps, they cannot be in two places at once. And thus, the commander of the 7th Army, you see him there with his eye patch looking somewhat like a pirate, Paul Hosser, Obergruppenführer, also of the Waffen-SS and other Waffen-SS generals, sitting there with Erwin Rommel. His forces are overwhelmed, and Cobra, once unleashed, the Germans can't get control of it. They can't stop it. And the American infantry fight a very determined battle, fighting through the bocage, which is how the French farmers divided all their farmers' fields to show who owned what. And there's the bombers bombing it. Of course, you see the area that is being torn apart with the Panzer Lehr Division, which is virtually annihilated. The American infantry battalion surged through 3 infantry divisions worth, and once they had captured the roads, the American armored columns are unleashed. And virtually the only way to conduct armored warfare in the bocage is to do it on the roads, and the Americans, like hell on wheels, as their 2nd Canadian Armored Division, that's the motto, they surge forward, and the Germans can't get in front of it. And once Cobra is unleashed, it can't be stopped. And thus the Normandy campaign is in its final days as the Americans surge forward, eventually to the point where they can unleash the U.S. Third Army of General George Patton and achieve victory with Patton's army sweeping around the south of Paris. Yes, holding them in place. This would not have been possible without the best German forces deployed almost exclusively against the 2nd Canadian Corps, the British 2nd Army, thus pinning them down until it was too late. And as the Germans attempted Impossibly to try to get in front of the Americans, a third army was unleashed on them, the 1st Canadian Army, which also attacked in Operation Totalize, and its big armored attack, and the entire German front begins to unravel. But we see here in this map here the actual square in which the B-17s bombed the Germans, and the survivors were found with blood coming out of their ears and noses, and they're capable of no further resistance. The American infantry swept over them, completely destroying the Panzer Lehr Division, and the US 7th Corps, its infantry attacked. The Germans cannot contain it. And as this is going on, General Montgomery, the commander of the 21st Army Group, urges what will become the newly activated 1st Canadian Army to conduct prodding attacks, to hold the Germans in place, to stop them from getting in front of the Americans in Cobra, to stop them from the British, from attacking the British supporting operation, Operation Bluecoat. And thus, a large number of Canadian infantry battalions, some of them fighting their first battle, attack Tilly-la-Campagne again. It's attacked on the 31st of July. It's attacked on the 1st of August. It's attacked on the 5th of August. There's a terrible defeat for the Black Watch of Montreal and Mace-Rouen, where they're ambushed on the 5th of August. And we see a penny packeting of resources in which what worked in Italy is attempted here in Normandy, and where massive force is needed, we have a squadron of tanks rather than a whole regiment, a company of infantry rather than an entire battalion. And thus tremendous losses are taken that didn't need to be. I argue in my books that the proper resources could have achieved victory. So conclusions. The Germans operate under severe limitations. What they can accomplish, they do. Anglo-Canadian forces are superbly supported with artillery and air support, but the ability of the Anglo-Canadian forces to attack with armor and win an armored battle that, as we think of it today, is somewhat of a Desert Storm type battle, with our tanks advancing through the desert, destroying other enemy Iraqi tanks and surging through. That was something, due to the level of technology at the time, they're somewhat impaired. So we see these Canadian infantry first operations, and some of these infantry battalions are badly mauled. The ridges are seen as key by the Germans, and all the resources are pushed there. The ability of the Anglo-Canadian forces to attack with armor and win an armored battle, when they're forced to fight one, was very lacking. And of course, later in August, Operation Totalize is a huge success. But we see then the German panzer divisions have largely disappeared. What's left is only the dregs of the 12th SS Panzer Division and parts of a Tiger Tank Battalion. So while we succeed later on, we're not in any way, shape, or form facing these massive resources that we did face in July and the early part of August. And thus, the US First Army broke out, massively aided in the process by a total lack of German armored reserves in the West, poor and inflexible German command and control, of course all their communications destroyed by the massive bombing. Wherever the Americans are, the Germans cannot get there in time, and they lack a defense in depth. Their defenses are somewhat limited, linear, and that when the Americans break through and charge through, there's no stopping them because you can't get in front of them. There's nothing left. And the key German reserves are all near Caen, ready to fight a future battle of El Alamein, a battle that never comes. And this is the new book. That's my new book, Defeat and Attrition of the 12th SS Panzer Division. This came out in July of last year. This talks about how the Germans failed miserably to drive the Allies back into the sea during the first few days after the invasion. And it's been my pleasure to be here now. I'll happily take any questions you guys may have for me. Oh, first, I'm right beside my wife, Michelle. Hello.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, the Germans were all pretty battle hardened by that time, I assume. The Allies, most of them were coming over from England where they'd been building up, having gotten through D-Day. Was there a real experience difference? Did that affect the way things went?
Some British divisions were taken from the North African desert and Italy and Sicily, so they're very much veterans, but of almost a different war. A war that they found in Normandy to be these bocage hedges, and Germans wanting to ambush them with these anti-tank Panzerfaust weapons, and attempting to charge up these hills, where as soon as they came over the crest with their tanks, the Germans would shoot them with their tanks. And some of these tanks that they'd never seen in North Africa, such as the Panther and the Tiger, which were very heavily armored with the sloped armor and the very, very powerful high-velocity 88mm and 75mm guns. So, well, you do see some amazing British performance in some of their infantry battles. Sometimes their tank units have a terribly tough time of it. Hopefully that answers your question. But yes, and some of the Germans, they had the same problem because they were veterans as well, but veterans of the Eastern Front. And they'd never seen this powerful artillery before. They'd never seen this air superiority and these fighter bombers and these Hawker Typhoons sweeping down. And thus they became creatures of the night. They couldn't traverse the roads during the day or supply their units or simply move around due to this terrible, awe-inspiring air power that seemingly is hiding behind every cloud. Yes, in the
question. I understand what you said. I thought your presentation was excellent. So Goodwood was first and Cobra was second.
Yes. The Spring and Cobra occurred at the same time.
Okay, but what if they had done Cobra first and Goodwood second? If the German armor is all sitting around Caen waiting for an attack or waiting to counterattack, Goodwood, regardless, has no German armor, not Goodwood, Cobra has no German armor in front of it. Why not Cobra first, and then everything that Goodwood wanted to be would have happened, because the Germans would have been forced to move all of their armor at night, if they wanted to, further west to engage the American army at Cobra. But good for the Americans. They were using a huge formation, doing a massive flanking attack, and great use of their bombers. I mean, Cobra looks great. Goodwood, if it had been the second phase after Cobra, would things have been different? Because Goodwood looks like a disaster.
Yes, the Germans managed to shut down Goodwood very effectively, and there was, I believe, a huge expectation that Goodwood would not fail, and Eisenhower is hugely shocked. The scandal, all these resources, all these bombs, all these bombers, and you only got, 10 kilometers? And the shock of it all, it is the scandal, and it very much damages Montgomery's reputation. But yes, it's a wonderful what-if question. If, of course, the resources of all those 4-engine bombers, they couldn't be at the same place at the same time. But yes, I guess the British asked first potentially of Bomber Command and the American 8th Air Force. But and also there was the perception that the Americans are very much stuck in the bocage. And they're just not getting anywhere. And every time they get to a field, there's 2 German paratroopers with their MG-42 machine guns and the Panzerfaust, and the Americans are literally running out of tanks due to their tank losses and the fighting in this bocage, which is terrible tank country. So yes, it's Cobra first. Should it have been first? Possibly in hindsight, yes. That would have made sense.
But Monty, after the war, gave the impression that the strategy all along was to hold the Germans in place in front of Caen in order to give the Americans the opportunity to go around the left, because their armor was stuck there. I get the impression you're saying that was never the plan at all.
No.
In fact, that's what happened. It wasn't the plan.
Yes. Charles Folks, in the planning stages of Spring, he sat down by General Simmons with his British accent, more British than British, and General Folks, Charles Folks, the commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. And he's sold Spring as very much a breakout attack. And he says later, as Chief of the Defense Staff in Ottawa post-war, he says, spring was very much a breakout offensive. What Guy Simmons, Montgomery's toady, is saying post-war, and these guys, of course, saying in their post-war memoirs that, of course, everything worked out exactly as planned. And the Americans got their opportunity, and we took on the Panzerwaffe and, held it there spectacularly so that the Americans could succeed at our expense. It was all part of the general plan, but I sincerely don't believe that, and I don't think Montgomery's ego would allow that. He, of course, wanted the glory and wanted the British Second Army to succeed and win and utterly defeat the Germans during the Normandy campaign. They did defeat them. The British Army did very much wear down the Germans in some ways, but not in the way that I believe Montgomery wanted it to happen. There it is.
So this might actually be a follow-up question to that in some ways. What is the takeaway of the 1960s by the British, and how did that inform their strategies at the time?
Oh yes, the British Army of the Rhine in the 1960s, of course, had all the elite British armored regiments, and it was ready to fight this titanic tank battle against the Red Army in West Germany, and to defeat them in the height of the Cold War. But there weren't enough British units. They weren't strong enough. The British economy couldn't make the masses of tanks like the Soviets were doing. So we need a historical example. An example how a supposedly inferior force held back a massive armored assault. And this example was Goodwood, except the Red Army would be the British, and the Germans would be the British Army in West Germany during the Cold War. And of course, they dragged out all the German veterans that wanted to participate in it. But of course, due to federal laws in West Germany at the time, you couldn't exactly drag out the Waffen-SS and have them parading around. It wouldn't work politically. So they relied very heavily on the German Das Heer, the regular army, and the 21st Panzer Division veterans who came out, and Hans von Luck tells his story of how he commandeered and dragooned an 88mm gun battery, and he forced it to fire on the British tanks, and he was a big hero for this. And this is, he tells this story hundreds of times, and he goes on television, and this is how the British officers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s learned about Goodwood, and how they were to fight in West Germany as part of NATO and win. Oh, and there's a fellow right there. Yes.
Those mine shafts on Verrières Ridge, I understand, were essentially a surprise.
Yes.
The guys attacking. How could our intelligence people not have known about something as big and established in Normandy as a mine?
Yes, it's a terrible failure, and they should have properly briefed the battalion commanders for this night attack, because they have this mine shaft complex, a huge number of buildings, and the big, I don't know what it's called, sort of a caterpillar track, or yes, the tunnels, and of course the it drags all the iron ore out of the ground, this sort of railroad almost. What is it? Sorry. Yes, that's exactly. And so all that was still there. They called it in their intelligence reports, you know what they called it? The factory. They called it the factory because they thought it was a factory rather than a mine. Just like a mine you'd see in northern Ontario. But it was all there. And so these Germans, of course, during these terrible artillery bombardments, they'd scurry right in, and then they'd scurry right out and appear in various locations, fight for a little bit, then disappear back in. Not a huge amount of Germans, but enough to cause trouble and sow discord in the rear areas of the Canadian infantry companies and platoons as they're attacking at night, and they're getting fired on from all directions. And so it's this very much a terrible infantry battalion, or infantry battle for the Canadians, but one that they have these very, very challenging situations they try to overcome. Yes, you got a further?
So how did we miss that?
I don't know how. Of course, they discovered it later on, and there's this famous photo of the Fusilier Montreal, and they have two guys, they're sitting like this with their rifles in the entrance to one of these holes, expecting the Germans to come out and they'll shoot them. But how they failed to because they've been in the area already on the 20th. They should have known. And, of course, recce platoons and scout platoons should have found these things out. And they could have spoken to the French civilians. They've been living there for their whole lives. So, yes, is it an embarrassing failure? It certainly is. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, fog of war could pretty well account for a lot of that. But what interests me is Operation Bagration, the destruction of Army Group Center, starts over on the Eastern Front on the 22nd of June.
Yes.
3 weeks after D-Day. So was there any chance at all, given that difference in time, that we would not have had to break through a concentration of SS divisions and good panzer divisions?
Oh, the good ones that arrived there, they'd already been sent out or planned to be sent out in the previous weeks. So the events of the 22nd, they didn't really affect Normandy too much. But
that's what I mean.
Yes, there were some very good units that were dispatched to the east, however, that could have fought in Normandy.
Yeah.
And these were the brand new Panther Tank Battalions of the 4th Panzer Division, the brand new Panther Tank Battalion of the 5th Panzer Division, and later on other heavy tank battalions that were dispatched to the east because of this huge disaster that's occurring in the center of the Eastern Front.
But all I'm suggesting is that in the 3 weeks between June 6th and June 22nd, it was almost a foregone conclusion that there were going to be heavy losses by the Allies.
By the Allies? Yes, given the amount of German armor and resources they pumped in. Because Hitler very much knew if the front line suddenly expanded to a greater distance, they'd need much more forces. And thus that motivated his not one step back mentality.
When did Hitler finally realize that the attack wasn't going to come in the Pas-de-Calais?
Around the end of July, we see the advent of all the German infantry divisions that were there and the really good defenses in the Pas-de-Calais suddenly start appearing. But by this time it's too late, and the panzer divisions have been bled white, and all the tanks have been destroyed, and these tremendous losses. So those excellent infantry divisions that could have acted as the cannon fodder to allow the panzer divisions to not hold the front line as an infantry division would, which is part of very much the theme of my new book. This Operation Fortitude, the deception operation, is tremendously successful. And that these beautiful, not beautiful, but very effective panzer divisions, rather than being proponents of mobile warfare and conducting maneuvers around the battlefield, they're forced to fight in trenches almost as if it is the First World War. And they, of course, are pinned in place for the Royal Artillery and Royal Canadian Artillery that simply blast them to bits. Oh, at the back there.
The 1st Polish Division should have been in Normandy at that time. I know they were heavily involved in Total Ice and the closing of the Calais Gap. Did they have any part of this at all?
No, their first combat action was Total Ice, and thus they attacked. But they weren't even in the front row of Total Ice. They came in on the 2nd day, and they do their big battle with the Germans on the 2nd day, on the 9th of August. But yes, they have some tremendously fierce fighting with the Germans, and that's the unique nature of the 1st Canadian Army. Half of it wasn't Canadian. The other half, of course, the 1st Canadian Corps was in Italy, so they had to have another corps, and these British corps come and go. And the Polish Armored Division is there, as well as various British infantry divisions. And then this finally is fixed in April 1945 as the two corps come together and the 1st Canadian Army is reunited. But yes, Total Ice and some of our biggest battles in Normandy as a 1st Canadian Army, they're fought by British soldiers and British tanks and Polish tank crewmen. Oh, Simon.
So what was Rommel's role in the German defense, and his thoughts on Cobra and Goodwood, the spring and stuff?
Yes, he was very much, he was caught in something pre-invasion called the Great Panzer Controversy. Rommel wanted to have the tank units right on the beaches. And thus, as the Canadian soldiers landed on Juno Beach, there was supposed to be a Panzer Division right there. But various other ones, the commander of Panzer Group West, General Geyer von Schweppenberg, the aristocrat, he wanted to conduct a battle of encirclement, a battle of maneuver deep within France, and actually let the Allies land and let them maneuver around France, and to conduct this sort of Panzer-style operation. And the elderly Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of the Army of the West here, he's the Oberbefehlshaber, the commander-in-chief of Army Group D, which is later called OB West. He very much favors Geyer von Schweppenberg's argument because they see that the British battleships and American battleships have destroyed the German tanks in Italy and in Sicily, and they feel that the battle on the beaches won't work. So Rommel, they've given him 2 or 3 Panzer divisions to make him happy, and then he goes and sulks in the corner because he is not given control of the elite Panzer divisions, which are part of Panzer Group West. And thus, one of them right there, the 12th SS Panzer Division, has to drive a huge distance on the roads, bombed and strafed the whole way, and thus arrives 1 day late and fights the Canadians on the 7th of June rather than the 6th. And thus, the Allies gain a definitive bridgehead, a beachhead that they defend ferociously and achieve victory in that the Germans do not drive them into the English Channel during the first crucial days after the invasion when they're most vulnerable. So Rommel, he's the commander of Army Group B, which controls the 7th Army and is responsible for the defense of northern France, but the key units to allow him to achieve victory are taken out of his hands. They're controlled by Panzer Group West, or they are OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, in the person of Adolf Hitler, who has to give his personal authorization to release them. And so on the 6th and 7th, a titanic battle is fought administratively on phone lines to release the 12th SS Panzer Division from Hitler's control, which it eventually is, but it arrives a day late, and thus its opportunity is to drive the Allies into the sea and defend France is wasted.
What date was Rommel wounded?
He was wounded the day before Goodwood. And of course, the 410 Squadron Spitfires of the RCAF, 2 of them are driving upon this, or flying above this main route. Rommel stupidly in his huge staff car that is not camouflaged. He leaves the 1st SS Panzer Corps headquarters, and Sepp Dietrich says, please take a smaller vehicle. Please take one that's camouflaged. Don't stay off the main roads. Rommel listens to none of this. And he's strafed, and his driver is killed. They drive the car into a ditch. Charlie Fox is the Spitfire pilot that fires the 20mm burst that destroys the staff car. Rommel's head is rammed right into the windshield. He takes a terrible concussion, and his eye is all badly damaged. And he's he recovers. He gets back his perfect health. And then as part of the 20 July plot, he is implicated and forced to commit suicide later that year.
So again, the date?
The 17th of July.
17th of July.
And Goodwood attacks on the 18th.
Right, and thereafter, so he never had any input into the...
He did create the defensive system that defeated Goodwood and, understood the key battlegrounds were Hill 113, 112, and Verrières and Bourgebus Ridges. Yes?
Yep, so a question about air power. So the Allies have air superiority, and you told us about how they use heavy bombers to break open both for Goodwood and for Cobra. And then you got all these guys like Charlie Fox. You've got all this tactical air, and I'm thinking if the Allies have air superiority, and the Germans just have tanks and artillery, and that's our main problem right in front of us, why not use tactical air to reduce their combat power, to take out tanks, to take out artillery, and reduce them down to a smaller level? I know that's how we do it today, And I'm wondering, was it like, did they not have enough tact here? Did they not have good doctrine? Did they not have an ability to locate German forces? Or did they not have effective weapons for killing tanks on the ground from small airplanes?
They fired the rockets, and the rockets were tremendously inaccurate. Very good for morale, but it's very difficult to actually hit a tank with these unguided weapons. They could do it with the 20-millimeter cannons on the Spitfires, but also very difficult as well. And each German tank at this time is a traveling bush. It's a bush that travels from one wooded area to another wooded area. Of course, during the very heavy tank firefights, the Germans didn't care. And they just drive up hills and they just, be all over the place, and they figured the hell with it. But for a Spitfire pilot cruising past at 300 miles an hour or 300 kilometers an hour, I don't know the exact, speed, it's very, very difficult. And while they could attack hills, and they could attack tanks that they had seen on the first pass and they circled around, but to get that, that cannon shell in the back deck of a Panther tank was a 1 in a million shot. And sometimes they did do it, but the level of ground attack technology we see today and take for granted, it just wasn't there. But if there was, it was a whole different story. If there was a truck with a load of artillery ammunition going along a road, or German Field Marshal Rommel, stupidly driving along, they were easy meat for the Spitfires and the Thunderbolts and the Mustangs and the Lightnings and the Hawker Typhoons. It was just endless. And of course, they would, the Americans in the U.S. 9th Army Air Force, the Tactical Air Force, were very much better at air-to-ground communication than the British. The British RAF was very much, you will not talk to us, we'll decide exactly what we want to do, and we'll decide how these airstrikes go in. So they had actual RAF pilots in armored vehicles. They wouldn't give the Army any, and there's the famous story of Sidney Radley Walters of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. He sees the German tanks on top of Verriers Ridge, and he does everything administratively perfectly to call in an airstrike on them. And it finally happens, but it's 2 hours later and the Germans have driven away. And it's tremendously frustrating for him, and this is a famous story that he tells again and again. And that's an important thing about these battles, is the figures, the historical figures they can drag out of the woodwork that come on these battlefield tours. They play a huge role in spinning the narrative. And how it actually happened is how they said it happened. And going through the primary documents and for this book, I often find that it is not how it actually happened. And there's certain characters who conduct huge roles in some of this combat that were killed. And of course, their stories are never told because they died in Hungary, or they're held prisoner in Russia for 20 years. Yes, these often these battlefield tours, they're very, very important because the same stories get told again and again and again, and they get elaborated upon, and thus history is created almost before your eyes. In the middle of these French fields outside a tour bus, and everybody's drinking at a pub at night, and these battlefield tours are what they are, but they should be recognized as such. Yes. Oh, yes.
Was there any measurable effect on German command and control after the attempt on Hitler's life?
The troops at the front were absolutely loyal. And they, like many brainwashed Germans in the 1930s and early 40s, a lot of them were 17, 18 years old, they believed almost in Adolf Hitler like a god. And it was incomprehensible that this had happened. And this was another stab in the back. And of course, all the responsible 20th of July plotters were quickly removed, and then the fighters at the front went back to the battle and went back to the war. They took notice of it, and they were disgusted by it because, of course, a lot of them were committed National Socialists, Nazis. And thus, they went back to the fighting for Germany to defend against this Allied onslaught that they feared if the Canadians and the British and the American soldiers broke out, they'd soon be in the streets of their hometowns in Germany, and thus they had to fight. But a lot of them very much wanted to escape with their lives, And you see a lot of the mass surrenders in August and even in July of the conscripts who choose to surrender to save their lives, and people from German families with a German background in Poland who are dragged into it, and they of course surrender at the first chance they can get. But there's many Germans that are very, very committed to fight to the end. And of course, ex-Hitler Jugend or Hitler Youth, they've been brainwashed since an early age that they are instruments of war. This is their destiny, and they are to fight, and to fight to the death for Germany, for the Reich. And it's a tremendous, disgusting tragedy that's, all these Germans, their lives are cast away. But that is the events of the Second World War. And yes. Yeah.
So obviously, seeing the first SS Panzer Corps, LAH being a very old division that had established itself on the eastern frontiers before, how do you think going south and Würzburg would have compared being relatively new divisions that had only fought for a few months, being formed in late 43?
Oh, the turnover within these divisions is tremendously high. So a person would be here today, gone tomorrow. They'd immediately be an infantry casualty on the Eastern Front. They could survive for a few months at best, and some of the surviving commanding officers, you see, they survive because they're in headquarters, and they're not fighting on the front lines. But of course, these German soldiers from in the years 1942, 1943, early part of 1944, they die and are buried in mass graves in the Ukraine, in Galicia, in Belarus, or White Russia, or what we call today the Belarus. So yes, the question of elite status, it doesn't really mean anything. Of course, having experienced commanders, it was entirely beneficial to the German tank units and some of their Panzer Grenadier units, but it was something that was here today, gone tomorrow. And after a couple of months, they're as experienced as they're going to get, as skillful as they're going to get. And that Canadian machine gun bullet is going to take them out of action the very next day. And so we see, especially in this Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, a tremendous shortage of senior NCOs, of experienced junior leaders. And everybody gets bumped up a rank. You see the units that are commanded by a certain rank, they should be commanded by the next rank up. But that guy has been killed and they've taken his place. And of course, they don't have the replacement system that the Canadian Army has, where if there's an infantry officer killed, and that's in my first book, The Army of Never-Ending Strength, there is always another replacement waiting, drinking a pint of beer in England, ready to be sent over to take over that infantry section, or an officer to take over that infantry platoon. We had that luxury for a little while. And of course, we weren't running this huge military apparatus that the Germans were, that they were ever expanding and didn't have the people to staff or train. And so it became a question of attrition in which these leaders and these trained, valuable people were immediately being killed by the Americans, killed by the British, killed by the Canadians, killed by the artillery in huge, huge numbers. And thus, the effectiveness of these units disintegrates as the key people, the leaders, the experienced people, the planners, the staff officers are stripped away in ones and twos over the course of 2.5 months.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.